My name is Serena Bailey, and I am going to be talking to you today about how to copy edit and fact check your stories. This is actually my favorite part of the journalistic process, which may sound a little strange because it's not the most creative part. It's not the most sort of getting out there and talking to people and creating new stories and finding new ideas. It's not that. It's probably the most rigorous part. But to me, this is where a piece of writing goes from being a piece of writing to a piece of journalism. This is where it gets put through the ringer a bit, it gets put into proper style, and it goes from being a normal piece of writing to something ready to be published in a newspaper or magazine. So today we're going to be talking about how to copy edit your stories, what you should be looking for when you're copy editing, the process that you might want to follow, some resources and some tips, and we're also going to be looking at what to fact check in your stories, how to fact check, and resources and tips for that as well. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself. I graduated with my master's degree in journalism from the University of Alabama last year, and I also went there for undergrad where I got my degree in journalism as well. While I was there, I worked with the Crimson White, I worked with Alice Magazine, I worked with the Tuscaloosa News, with Alabama Heritage Magazine, and a couple other publications. And I did a lot of writing, but I also did a lot of copy editing and a lot of fact checking. And along the way, I sort of developed a bit of my own process and have my own approach to it. And that's kind of what I want to share with you today. We're going to start with copy editing because that's really where everything should start. There's no point to fact checking a story until you know exactly what the story is, and copy editing is where you learn what the story is. So you're going to talk first on what you should focus on, then how to approach the process, and then some resources and some advice. When I am copy editing a story, I look for 5 things. I first look for spelling. You always want to make sure you're spelling things correctly. That is very important. People get very upset when you spell their name wrong. No one likes to have their name spelled wrong. No one likes to have their street name spelled wrong. Always check for spelling. You want to check for grammar, which is also super important and often a very underloved part of this process. You should absolutely be checking for AP style because that's very important, and that's where things can get a little iffy and a little tricky and into the weeds. You should always have your AP style book with you. It will save your life. Then you should also be checking for 2 more things which are a bit more subjective. Comprehension. Is your story understandable? Can you follow it? Does it make sense? Does it have a point? And flow. Does your story logically flow from point A to point B? Does one quote lead into the next point? Does one source lead into the next? Those kinds of things. My process goes a little like this. I start by reading through the whole story. I check for comprehension and understanding and flow, and then I check for spelling, style, and grammar. Sort of what I'm trying to do in this process is first take in the forest for the trees. Make sure you know what's going on in the big picture and work your way to the tiny details. So the first part, you really need to read through your story from start to finish. Note the obvious mistakes as you go. You're not going to be able to stop yourself from noticing the obvious mistakes. Like somebody absolutely should have noticed, this is not how you spell bird. We all know how to spell bird. This is not it. So you need to read through it, start to finish, note the obvious stuff, and move on from there. Once you've noted the obvious, read through the whole story, you have an idea of what's going on, check to make sure you understand it. Work with the writer, because you want the story to be understandable and readable. If you're confused, the audience is definitely going to be confused. So what doesn't make sense in the story? Are there points where things become unclear? Is there missing information? Or is there a lack of sufficient explanation for some things? Note confusing passages and ask the writer. Are there sentences in the story that tripped you up? Long, complicated sentences sometimes lose their point along the way. You start at one thing, you add in a couple phrases offset by commas, and you've lost the meaning of the sentence by the end. Note those sentences, work with the writer to see if you can split them or shorten them to increase clarity. This is where this comes in. All this talk about asking the writer, noting the writer, that's what you want to do next. You want to ask questions and make suggestions. You want to check for relevance. Why did the writer include the things they include? Point A should lead to point B. If a source is mentioned, they should be quoted or paraphrased shortly after. If you don't immediately understand the relevance of something, whether it's a source, a quote, a fact, or whatever, so if you don't immediately understand its relevance in the story, you need to ask the writer. And here's the other thing. At this point in the process, you're not yet looking for the tiny details, which means that you can move things around. If there's something at the end of the story that you think would work better at the beginning, don't be afraid to make that suggestion. Don't be afraid to say, hey, you quoted this source way down at the bottom. I think it would be much better up at the top. If you think that there's an anecdote later in the story that makes a better lead, don't be afraid to make a note. Be like, this is a much more interesting idea for a lead, maybe. Make suggestions. You are not there to rewrite the story for the writer, but you are a part of this process. It is very collaborative. Don't be afraid to make those suggestions. Now that you have an understanding of the big picture, of the whole narrative that the writer is trying to tell, now it's time to get into the weeds. Now it's time to check for spelling and grammar and style. Start with spelling. Check all names, all proper nouns, anything that looks like it could be possibly spelled wrong, those words that you trip over constantly. If you're not 100% sure it's spelled right, check it. Check it against the dictionary, check it against Google, check it against the reporter's notes. Don't be afraid to double and triple check. Same thing goes with grammar. Don't be afraid to Google grammar questions. Grammar is an underloved part of this process, and grammar is, let's be honest, the thing we all hate to think about. There's so many grammar rules in English, we don't always remember them. That's why we have Google. Google it. That's what I do all the time. And never, ever publish a story without checking for style. The obvious thing, we all know this. It has to be checked against AP style. We love AP style, we hate AP style. It's great, it's wonderful, it's confusing, and it changes constantly. Always, always, always check for style. Your style book is your best friend and your lifeline. Whether you have a physical style book or whether, like me, you have an online subscription to the AP style book, check anything that you think might even possibly need to be checked against AP style. Whenever you go to check for grammar, always start with making sure that your sentences are an active voice. What do I mean by active voice? Active voice is where the subjects of your sentences are the ones doing the actions, rather than having the actions done to them. So a sentence written in active voice would be, he wrote the book. He, the subject, is doing the action of the sentence, writing the book. A passive voice version of that sentence would be, the book was written by him. In that case, the book, the subject of the sentence, is having an action done to it. It is being written. You always want to go with active voice. He wrote the book. It makes for much more engaging writing. It makes for much more energetic writing, and it just flows a lot easier. You also want to be careful when you're checking for grammar about punctuation, particularly periods and commas. Remember that in terms of quotes, periods and commas go inside quotation marks. This is also a good point to stop and remind you that attribution for a quote goes after the first sentence. So you would have something like the example on the slide, which says, quote, periods and commas go inside quotation marks, comma, close quote, she said, period. Open quote, that's an easy mistake to make, period, close quote. While we're still talking about grammar and moving into style, let's take a moment and discuss the Oxford comma, which is that comma that's placed before the last object in a series. There are people in this world who don't like the Oxford comma, and there are people in this world who love the Oxford comma. As a journalist, if you're working in journalism, you're sort of professionally obligated to be on the side of people who don't like it. AP style specifically is against it unless it's absolutely necessary. But for the most part, it's not going to be. There are ways around using an Oxford comma. So for example, there's a sentence on your slide that maybe needs a little work, maybe should have an Oxford comma. And it says, she thanked her parents, comma, Jesus and Madonna. Now without an Oxford comma before and Madonna, it makes it sound like her parents are Jesus and Madonna, which is most likely not true. you can take a wild stab in the dark and say that her parents are not Jesus and Madonna. So a much better version of that sentence, if you want to avoid using the Oxford comma, would be to simply move around the order of things. So a much better version of that would be, she thanked Madonna, comma, Jesus, and her parents. You have a sentence that is logical, comprehensible, has no room for misunderstanding, that does not use the Oxford comma. But you'll also notice that I've reworked the sentence into a quote. Because if you are quoting someone and they say, I would like to thank my parents, Jesus and Madonna, you want to use the Oxford comma. You want it to say, I would like to thank my parents, comma, Jesus, Oxford comma, and Madonna. Some common style rules you always want to pay attention to include numbers and titles. With numbers, 1 through 9 are always spelled out, but 10 and up always use the numeral. And don't start a sentence with a number, or at least try not to. And whenever possible, don't do it. If you do have to start a sentence with a number, no matter where it is, 1 through 10 or more than 10, spell it out. You also need to pay attention to titles. Check the rules against the style book. And remember, if they don't have a medical degree, they unfortunately don't get to be called doctor in the story. Some other common style rules you may want to bookmark include the rules about city and street names and the rule about first references. With city and street names, you want to make sure that whatever city you're using, it doesn't need to be followed up by the state that it's in. And with street names, you want to check abbreviations. Usually, unless you're using it in a full address with a number, you don't abbreviate it, but there can be some exceptions. Check your style book. Remember the rule about first references too? On first reference, first and last name, plus their relevant title to the story. On second reference, only refer to the source by last name. There are a few exceptions to this, and sometimes including children. Whether or not you reference children by last name on second reference will sometimes be up to your publication. And the big exception, if you're quoting two people with the same last name. You always want to refer to them by both first and last name on second reference, so there's no confusion. Style changes often, and some publications have different styles that they want you to use. So if you're ever in doubt, ask your editor. They will either guide you to the style book or they will tell you what their style is. I think I may have mentioned it before, but AP Style updates their rule book yearly. Sometimes they change only a handful of rules, sometimes they overhaul entire sections. So keep up with it, see what's new, but just because AP Style changes doesn't mean that your editors want you to implement all those changes. An example of this that I ran into within the past year is the percent rule. So up until a couple of years ago, AP Style was very clear. You always wrote out the word percent. So if you used 10% in a story, it was the number 10 and the word percent. Within the past year, AP Style has changed that rule to where you can use the percent sign if you want to. My editors at the publication I was working for didn't want to. They quite liked the old rule. So I had to make a note to always follow that old rule. Always check and see when AP Style changes if your editor wants you to implement those changes. Which brings us to the topic of house style. Some publications have their own style books that they follow, most famously the New York Times. Make sure that you know any localized or other rules that your publication has. Also be aware of the difference between said versus says. Newspapers, more often than not, will use said, and some magazines will use says. Each gives a different feel to a story. Always make sure you know which one to use. If you're ever in doubt, just go with said. You can fix it later. Now that you've taken in your entire story, now that you've made sure that it flows correctly, that it's understandable, that it's readable, that it's properly spelled, grammatically correct, and follows the correct style, you've done a lot of marking up to your story. You've made a lot of changes. You may have even shuffled entire paragraphs or sentences around. You may have deleted things, you may have added things. So the very last step in the copy editing process is to read through your story one more time and make sure that everything checks out. Make sure you didn't do more harm than good. Make sure you didn't forget to patch up a hole somewhere. Some really good resources to have bookmarked aside from your style book and your own instincts include dictionary.com to make sure those words are spelled correctly, and as well as the Grammarly blog and this website called Grammar Girl. Both of those last two will really help you with the nitpicky things about grammar and those weird grammar rules that you may not have studied since like middle school. And as just a fun little aside, you can also follow the AP Stylebook on Twitter at AP Stylebook. They constantly update things there, and they often have these little style chats about certain topics. They're also very good when breaking news is happening, like a natural disaster or a big national election or something like that, putting out a current relevant style guide. So you can sort of check those rules you only ever use once in a while when big things are happening. If you're looking for something a little fun, you can also follow BuzzFeed Stylebook on Twitter at Stylebook, which is where they have a link to their actual style book that they use, where you can see sort of a bit more of pop culture rules, a bit more of like internet-based rules. So if you're writing a story that is a little less formal, you may be able to use that style guide to give you an idea of how to refer to internet culture or pop culture. Now that you've copy edited your story, and now that you've made sure it looks nice and pretty, you need to make sure that it's correct. You need to fact check it. So that's what we're going to talk about next. We're going to talk about what you need to fact check, how you need to fact check it, and some more resources and some more advice. So what do you fact check in your story? The short answer is everything. The long answer is anything stated as a fact in the story. Titles, assertions made by sources, facts cited by the authors, any statement made as a statement of truth in the story needs to be fact-checked. There's this good interview with one of the researchers for This American Life and S-Town where he says this, quote, "You are there to interrogate the living hell out of every single utterance of fact, and a good writer wants you to do it and is relying on you to do it," end quote. So how do you do that? Where do you even start? Because journalistic stories are statement after statement, fact after fact. Where do you start? You start at the beginning. You pick up a good pen, you grab your healthy dose of skepticism, and you take it line by line. Check statements, quotes, names, titles against recordings, transcripts, and notes from the writer, and verify those from other sources when available. Don't be afraid to Google things. Don't be afraid to reach out to original sources. Get their contact info from the writer or seek it out for yourself. Reach out and question them directly about where they got their information, why they said the thing they said. Some good outside resources to fact check things, big concepts that maybe aren't localized, maybe aren't super specific, include Snopes, Fact Check, and PolitiFact. If someone else has done the work for you and has cited their sources and you can trace those sources back, you are good to go. Just make sure it's right. Sometimes though, those places aren't going to help you, and you're going to need to go to Google and you're going to need to hunt down some place where you can verify this fact. But if you search for something in Google, you're going to get a lot of results. So let's talk about some Google tricks. Don't forget to use quotation marks. If you're looking for a very specific phrase, if you put that phrase in quotation marks, Google will only show you results with that specific phrase. If you want to make sure that you're only getting sites like org sites, gov sites, or edu sites, just type in your query and then put site, edu, gov, org, whatever. You can also do this for entire websites. You want to only search the New York Times website for something? Site nytimes.com. That will give you only where that thing is found on the New York Times website. If you're looking for a specific document, a specific image, or a specific PDF, don't be afraid to put file type, PDF, doc, JPEG. That will pull up only documents, PDFs, and images related to your query. And don't be afraid to mix and match these things to really narrow down your Google search to find that specific item you're looking for and save yourself from time from having to scroll through a bunch of stuff that's not relevant. Once you track down the source of a piece of information, you want to evaluate that source to make sure that it's legitimate. How do you do this? Well, there's this thing called the CRAP test, C-R-A-P. currency, reliability, authority, and purpose and point of view. You want to first evaluate it for currency. How recent is the information? How recently was the source updated? Something from last year is probably going to be a bit more reliable than something from 10 years ago. How reliable is the source? Does the person stating the information, the organization stating the information, do they provide sources for that statement? Can you trace this source back, this information back from source to source to source to the original? What is the reputation of the source that you're currently looking at? And you want to make sure about authority. What are the credentials of the source? Do they have a stake in the story? And you also want to look at purpose and point of view. Is the source fact-based or opinion-based? Is it biased? Are they trying to sell you something? Taking these 4 things into account when evaluating a source can help you decide if it's a legitimate authority on the subject or not. This works best with written sources, but you can use a modified version on human sources too. Sometimes, especially in breaking news situations, the source of your information may be a social media post. You still want to try to the best of your ability to verify the post authenticity. And that starts by verifying the poster's authenticity. Start by asking if they're verified. Do they have a little check mark next to their name? Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. A lot of times they won't. Not all of us are big enough on the internet to have check marks next to our name. So then you want to start looking at how old the account is. The newer the account, the more cautious you should be. If they've been on Twitter 10 years, you can probably think they're a real person. But you also want to look at other things about their account. Do their posts vary? Do they only post about one topic if they're not an official account? If they're an official account only posting about one topic, that's pretty understandable. That's their topic. But if they're just a regular person like you or I and they're only posting about one thing, that can be a little suspicious. Do they share posts from other accounts or do they only post original content? When real people use Twitter, they retweet things, they reply to things, they comment on things. This is true on Facebook and other social media sites as well. If you do not see that kind of activity on someone's Twitter page, they may not be real and you may want to find the information from another source. You've grown up with social media. I've spent a lot of my life with social media. You kind of have a feel for what's a trustworthy account and what's not. Trust your gut. If it smells fishy, it probably is. Here's the big rule of fact-checking. If you can verify something from 2 separate independent sources, you can reasonably call it a fact, as much as anything can be a fact. But sometimes, every so often, something will be stated in a story, and it will get past the writer, it will get past the copy editor, it will get past anyone else who looks at the story, and you will print a mistake. What do you do when that happens? The first thing you do is own up to it. You admit that you're wrong, full stop. No excuses, no nothing. Apologize to a source if necessary. Then you put out a correction as soon as possible, as publicly as possible. Correct the error in online editions of the story and put a note at the top or bottom of the page. Run a correction in print if you're with a print publication as well. Do both of those things, online and in print. And the third step is to identify how the mistake was made. Work backwards through the process. Talk to people involved. Figure out where we went wrong. And then make a note, not a mental note, an actual literal note, so that you remember it, it sticks in your head, and you have it to go back to when you're in a similar situation later, so that you don't make the same mistake again. Ben Phelan, the researcher for This American Life in S-Town that I quoted earlier, has another quote from the same interview that I think sums up fact-checking and its process and the approach to it very well. And it's this: you lean into your paranoia and let it engulf you. Then you do the things a professional is supposed to do and find 2 sources. You write them on the page, then you walk away, next fact. That's fact-checking. You take what a journalist has given you, you look at it, and you go, can I find this stated somewhere else twice Can I find 2 other places where this has been stated? You make a note of where those places are, and you move on to the next fact, and you do it again. If you're looking for more resources talking about the process of fact-checking and tools you can use, there are quite a few of them out there. I particularly love Better News has a topic page about fact-checking. It's at betternews.org/topic/fact-checking. The American Press Institute also has that interview with Ben Phelan where he gets really into the weeds about how he fact-checked S-Town. You can Google that. It's from American Press Institute. I'm not going to say the URL out loud because it's very long, but it is on the screen, and you can also just Google American Press Institute S-Town 5 Good Questions, and it's all about how they fact-checked that. Before we leave for the day, I'd just like to share a few final thoughts and pieces of advice on the copy editing fact-checking process. And I'd like to start with this one. Noticing other people's mistakes is easy, much easier than noticing your own. Fact-checking and copy editing are a process where you are forced to call people out on their mistakes. But you have to do it constructively, and you have to do it with respect. You can't say things like, you got all this style stuff wrong. You have to say, I fixed some style errors I noticed. You can't say things like, this doesn't make any sense. You have to say, I didn't quite understand what you mean here. Can you explain it to me? You have to listen to what your writers say, and you have to work with them, not against them. Editing and fact-checking are the point in the process where the story becomes collaborative with the rest of the newsroom. Because at the end of the day, it's not just the reporter's byline under that story. Your publication and their publication's masthead are above that story. It's all a part of one big publication. A newspaper is more than just one story, and a newsroom is what it takes to put that paper together. You have to work with these people collaboratively. But when you get to a writer's story, you also have to remember that it is their story. They have something they are trying to say with their story. And your job is to help them clarify their voice in the story, clarify their point, clarify their narrative, not strip their voice from the story. You want to work with the writer to make the story as clear as it can be, as concise as it can be, and as correct it can be. Those are the 3 big things you should always be working towards in the copy editing fact-checking process. And the final piece of advice I'd like to leave you with today is this. Be the editor that you would want to write for and the writer that you would want to edit for. Understanding makes the whole process so much smoother, so much more productive, and so much more fun. And it makes for a better story, a better newsroom, and a better publication. Thank you for joining me today and letting me talk about my favorite part of the process. I've never done a lecture like this before, so this has been very fun, and I hope it was just as fun for you as it was for me. Thank you again for tuning in, and I wish you all the best of luck in your future writing endeavors.